Thank you for joining us live with Miami's Community News. And our special guest is somebody that I've admired for many, many years, Ana Veciana-Suarez. So welcome and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Michael, for having me.
And so you spent many years at the Miami Herald, the Miami News, God bless them, the Palm Beach Post.
Yes.
And you were a feature writer.
Feature writer, columnist, I was an editor, I did everything.
For full disclosure, your daughter did some work here 25 or maybe 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's when we first met. But I was a big follower of yours many, many years, as there are literally thousands of people that have followed you and admire your work. So you've written 4 books so far. Your most recent one, why don't you show us and tell us a little bit about that?
It's Dulcinea. So I thought I'd start a little bit with the backstory. As a journalist, I always want to know why and what's the backstory. And when I was in 10th grade reading Don Quixote in this old Spanish, and reading is kind of a euphemism because I was struggling through this archaic Spanish, I always thought, wow, Dulcinea is like in the wings, you know, she's been exiled. I said, one day, I knew I wanted to be a writer. I'm going to write about her. Well, 50 some years later, I did. So I kept that promise. But it's the story of a woman named Dolça Lul Prat, which I imagine she's fictional. She's a wealthy Barcelona woman who falls in love with this impoverished poet soldier who happens to be named Miguel Cervantes. Of course, their relationship is forbidden for many reasons, including the difference in class. But they manage it until he writes his masterpiece and names his primary female muse for her, and thus exposes their relationship. Years later, on his deathbed, he writes her a note asking to see her one last time. So she races across the dangerous roads of Golden Age Spain, faces the Inquisition, bandits, illness, to see him before he dies, and really to unburden herself as well of a secret.
As you explain that, you're very much involved in the passion of telling that. What was it like when you were creating this?
Well, in the beginning, I knew I wanted to do that, and I knew I wanted a character. When I write my books, it's always kind of a character in a conflictive situation, because that's what makes good fiction. But I knew very little about late 16th century Spain or early 17th century Spain. So I was really, to be honest with you, a little scared and frightened about doing the research, but I said, I'm a reporter. So I ended up doing about 1.5 years of just reading in both Spanish, mainly in Spanish, actually. And you become so immersed in this world that, for example, at dinner, I would tell my husband, do you know, and it was just some totally unrelated, obscure factoid of that era. And then, you know, you live with these characters for, in my case, almost 4 years, and they become part of you. You become invested in them, and you know, it's hard.
So with your other books, what are the other books you've written?
Well, I have 2 novels.
Mm-hmm.
One, my first one, which was written for adults, because the other one was a middle grade, was called The Chinquisquín, and it's based in the neighborhood in Miami that I grew up in. So everything was very familiar, and it was a very different story. So, of course, you know, I had to do research to kind of, you know, revive my memory of that time, but not to the extent of this. And then I did a middle grade Flight to Freedom that was for scholastic books for the diary of a young Cuban girl who comes to Miami in the late 60s. So I did a little research, because obviously I wasn't old enough at that time to have a great grasp. So I did, but not to the extent of this. And so it was different.
When you mentioned that in 10th grade, you had read some things and you made a promise that you were going to do this, when did you realize that you wanted to be a creative person?
You know, I come from a totally non-creative family. So I come from, you know, my father was a CPA, my uncles are doctors. None of my children were remotely interested in writing. They're so fiction readers. They read for their industry, which is mainly finance. But I remembered always reading and reading and reading, but I didn't really show an aptitude. It's almost kind of embarrassing. I didn't really show an aptitude for writing. I was, like the rest of my family, very math oriented. But I kept at it and I read and read, and that helped, I think.
So when you put together your first piece, whether it was 500 words or 5,000, and you completed it, what was that like for you?
You know, I always say that I hate the process of writing, and this is so true, and every writer will say that. But I like looking back, even if you know that just your first draft, you have to revise and revise and revise. But it's such a sense of accomplishment. And a lot of times you write and you don't always know what you're going to say or even what you're thinking. Even though I'm a plotter and I plot and I outline, a lot of times I just go off on a tangent. I'm writing and something pops up.
So when you write, sometimes when you write it, let's say on a Monday, and you look back on a Wednesday, you go, I'm going to change it?
Well, what I've learned with anything, you know, when you're writing 90,000 words, it's very different. I write a syndicated column when it's 600 to 650 words, which to me is like nothing, because a 90,000 word, you know, and usually it's more, and I tend to overwrite and then I have to edit. But what I have learned to do with time is that I will reread what I've written the previous day, but I try to avoid making any drastic changes, and then I continue, because I think when you're putting down your first draft, you want the momentum of the story and you want the story to move you forward. And then, of course, that, even though to me the hardest part is always the first draft, because you're figuring out the road you're getting. I always know the ending, but you're figuring out how to get there. But the revisions are just, you know, just hard.
So there's that magic when you sit down on your keyboard, and if you're old enough, on a typewriter, and as you sit there and you put your fingers down, and all of a sudden you're looking and you go, look at this. Look what's happening, and the connection, and to see it and to go back to. So I understand your fulfillment part of that. So tell us about some of the organizations that you work for, other than those that we mentioned.
Well, I mainly have done newspaper work, and I've always said that journalism is the best training ground for any writer. Of course, writing journalism, is especially newspaper journalism, is very, very different than writing fiction. But it teaches you how to research. It teaches you how to write quickly, and I am not a quick writer, and I'm not a natural writer. But I think more than anything, in journalism, you have a deadline. And those deadlines are sacred, because if you don't meet your deadline, you lose your job. So you learn that this inspiration that people think about, this muse that kind of comes and goes, you're not its friend, and that muse is not your friend. You put your butt in the chair, and it's a job, and I work, you know, my hours as if I were in the office. I dress as if I were in the office, so I see no one except my dog. And, you know, it's a job. But I think journalism is really a lot of different jobs put together. that of a researcher, that of a writer, that of almost of a publicity person, because you have to convince people to talk to you.
So there were some times you were doing hard news.
Yes, I did. And I think everybody cuts their teeth in
Yes.
hard news.
And so when you write, I know it must be important to you to make sure you get the facts correct and be able to deliver them in a way that somebody can read them and hopefully understand it. So when people would email you and say, "You got it wrong, lady," right? What went on the inside when you would say, "Well, maybe I did, or maybe I didn't interpret it correctly, or maybe I didn't write it as clear as I could"?
I think most of the time everybody makes mistakes, especially when you're writing that first draft of history, as they call journalism. But your ultimate goal as a journalist is to get it right the first time. It's also a little different, what I have found, because you can, if you reread your stories, you can always figure out other ways and better ways to write it.
So if there were two reporters going to the same event, sometimes you could look at it and go, they were both there and they both grabbed onto different parts.
To different
And that's
things.
like normal. To do
and,
that.
and that's normal. Just like if I chose to tell the story of probably the most famous female character in Spanish literature in a particular way that was probably very unique to me, very different from the woman in Man of La Mancha, which is, kind of a fan fiction of Don Quixote. And I drew.
Should I put on the YouTube?
Yeah, to put it on. And I drew from what I was familiar. I set much of that story in Barcelona, which is a city I'm familiar with. My ancestral home is, even though I'm Cuban by birth, my mother was born in Catalonia, about an hour away from Barcelona. Much of my father's family still lives there. I visited family and I'm familiar. And in doing research, I had to read a language I had not heard since my grandparents, which was Catalan, even though I hear it when I visit there, when I visit my cousins there. So it was something that's unique to me. Another writer would have done different.
And who were some of your mentors and people that helped you along your way?
There was strangely enough, in journalism at the Miami News, and I think the Miami News, I always think of it as the David against the Goliath of the Miami Herald. And we were in afternoon newspapers when people were no longer reading afternoon newspapers.
It closed in the 80s.
Yes,
late
closed
80s.
in the 80s. I had left by then and joined the Herald. But by starting off at the Miami News, you always had to look for a different angle. And the editors there taught me well. There was a sports editor who was my first husband, my late husband's boss, a man named John Crinden. And he was an old Southern boy who loved to tell a tale and admired good writing. And one day he walked over to me. I was 21, which I can't imagine. I've had children who are 21 and I'm thinking, they don't know anything. And he really took me under his wing and he saw something in me, and I did write sports. And we kept the friendship after my first husband died and until his own death.
So was he the guy with the hat and the cigar? And
Oh,
sitting
yeah.
at the typewriter?
Oh, my gosh. Very old Miami, just very, very old school. And it was a strange friendship because we were totally different, had totally different views. And, he cared enough, to make sure that I was headed in the right direction.
So now you're a veteran author, your fourth book. Tell us about the book fair and how that has affected your life.
Well, I remember the first book fair. I remember how people viewed Miami in those 80s. And I think that the work that Mitchell Kaplan of Books and Books and Eduardo Padron of Miami-Dade College did to put Miami on the literary map, I don't think can ever be repaid, because they put Miami on the literary map. And Miami was known, had writers, but they were always, crime or thriller writers. And now you can see so many, 40 years later, Miami Book Fair is 40 years old. You can see where we have this new crop of writers across the genres, but literary fiction, which was sorely missing, and children's literature, both middle grade and younger kid lit, that are amazingly talented. And I think they were instrumental in that.
When we see people do things for the first time, a lot of people say, "Oh, it can't be done." Then after it's done, well, of course. And so those two men, and Dr. Padron certainly gave his entire career to us here in Miami-Dade County, a gentleman's gentleman. And Mitch was a wondrous person that he was able to evolve and make things happen and to share what he learned and what he was learning with the world. And to think of when you go down there and you go, there are a lot of smart people here. This is a good crowd, right? The people that care about about themselves and about the world, and seeking to share what they do with other people. So let's talk about your sharing that you do when you share your books and you share the stories, the literally hundreds, if not thousands, I guess, over the years. As you look back over these last 25 or 30 years, how do you view what you've done for the community?
I think I did more for myself. When I actually proposed to the Herald to do a column, I told them I felt there was a need within journalism to tell the story of women like me, working mothers, who did not have a voice within journalism. It was hard news. We were all trained on hard news, but there was no space for the conversation or the secrets you might share with your neighbor over the fence, whatever it might be, raising children, the hardship of caring for parents, getting I'm always surprised by the emails I get, like I wrote about adopting at our age, as I say, a new puppy, and how all our friends said, "You're crazy." And they were right. And I got, because people see their own lives. And what I've tried to do is just tell my story in a very simple way, what I've gone through, the hardships, the sorrows, but also the disappointments and the happiness of what is everybody's life. My life is really no different. And so they can see it mirrored by theirs.
And I think that's an important thing to be able to do, to bring it from the shadows and bring it up front, so somebody says, "Oh, look at this." Now, Madeline Pumariga, the first woman president of Miami-Dade College, was our guest speaker a few weeks ago. She so tied up the American dream and how to achieve that. Here's at that point, a girl from Hialeah. And for us that raised on the southern end, we always ridicule Hialeah.
Yes, yeah.
And here she is, the president of Miami-Dade. The calls that we got, this is what the women would say. And there would be spontaneous applause when she spoke. She said, "She was talking about me, Michael, single, from Cuba, no money, parents never went in, lost. They, 2.5 million graduates, by the way, since they started, provided a pathway." And when you would see her, she wasn't just saying it, she was living it and providing so much inspiration for people. And so when people that are in a suppressed state, and there are a lot of women that still feel that, it's our obligation to bring it up front so that we can make a difference. We've been working with a lot of nonprofits, Chapman Partnership, Children's Trust, NAMI, Be Strong International, and doing a lot of work on mental health and being able to bring it from the shadows and bring it so there can be a conversation, because we've recognized as far as mental health and food fears and suicides and murders, that leaves people, all those kids that don't have parents today, all those kids that are being adopted, that having some struggles with that. And I think there are a lot of people that want to hear you, and they want to see you, and they want to know that you're talking about them. So what I hope that you do is you continue on your way, all right? And to be able to bring this and put it on the table so we can all talk about it, because it does make a difference.
And I think when you recognize, and that's the beauty of reading, but when you recognize yourself in the pages, and the characters don't have to be your, of your same tribe to speak, but when you recognize there's the emotions of motherhood, there's the emotions of falling in love that transcend generations and all kinds of boundaries.
When you talked about this, you were very much involved in that. That it's more than you just like absorbed it. It's you've internalized this.
And you live, like I say, with these characters for 4 years. They become, the people who live with you. You're having dinner and you're thinking, well, should she have done this? Should I do this? And it's hard when you're not a writer, when you explain this to people, like, they'll look at you and they wonder, but it's true. And going back, I'm a proud Miami-Dade College grad. Back then, it was not I went to the downtown campus and worked on the student newspaper. And it was very interesting because my parents, I very much wanted to go away, had applied, and my parents would not let me. Now, I can tell you that my children would have said, "You don't let me? Forget this, I'm leaving." But it's, we're different time. But my parents were exiles. It was to them the fact of a daughter. I'm sure my older brother would have been allowed to go if he had wanted. But I think this is still true for many people. So it's not just first generation college aspirants, but there's people young students who can't afford to go away and live away, or whose parents say, no, you're not that whole wide world. It's scary. And it's a great experience. It's a great college.
So Miami-Dade offers, as the president pointed out, you want to become an air conditioning guy? You want a plumber? You want the certificate? FIU also has under their trade school, you can become certified in a whole lot in the construction arena. No charge at FIU. I don't know what the charge is at Miami-Dade, but it's so inexpensive that people can walk out of there with no debt, right? That's what the president says, and be able to go out and take care of themselves and family. So she says, you could be a physician or an MIT graduate and design rocket ships, or you can be an electrician or a carpenter.
Right.
And so one of the things that Miami-Dade does is provide an opening for people for this big pathway, this big opening to life and to the workforce. So we work a lot with Miami-Dade College. I hope they come back. We've been fortunate enough to interview all the presidents over the last 2 years, and I was friends with my anatomy and physiology teacher for 45 years after I graduated.
As I am with my journalism teacher from Miami-Dade, Peter Townsend.
Peter Townsend, I know that name.
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Peter and Jane, and his wife Jane.
Oh, I see his name. Isn't he still around?
He is still around.
Son
he
of a
is
gun.
still around.
Okay, every once in a
And
while.
we still talk and.
Wow. So let's talk about artificial intelligence and how this might affect people in the journalism arena. So any thoughts about it yet?
Well, I have actually, this is very funny because early this morning, we have a family WhatsApp and all kinds of things appear there. And early this morning, I was telling them how I had gone on to ChatGPT, and I had used it when it was officially, how it was a big announcement back in November, but mostly to do research and then go back to make sure that it was doing, but never to write anything, because I for the person who derives no pleasure from the writing, this is great. But part of writing for me is the creation is pleasurable, so I'm not going to give it to
Right.
her. But I said, let me see what kind of description they would have on Dulcinea, the
Okay.
book. So I typed in, I tried different prompts. It was hilarious. First of all, it got the name wrong. When I then inputted my name, it cited the setting and the plot of my first novel. So it had nothing to do with Spain. And then it invented some quote from I don't know where. So so I happened to, I put the samples of this on this. My sister then said, there are a lot of different ways to do prompt. Her husband is a data analyst, so very much into the tech world. But I think that I have no problem with it. I know that there are some writers who think this is, the world coming to an end. I think whatever makes it easier for us to find information. Mm-hmm. But I do think it's important as a writer that whatever is facilitated by AI is attributed to AI. I mean, I've read, I don't know how many articles, if you're on writer's block, if you have writer's block, put in and it'll make it. Well, I've tried that. Didn't work.
So some people I've spoken to that are like, at this point, they're sort of against it. I said, is it okay if we train robots to play soccer or to play chess? Yes. I said, so they're learning how to do that. And so we know with AI that you have to be able, you call them prompt, you have to know the right questions and to be able to look and say, what information is that and how can that help me do whatever it is? So sometimes I'll do it to get my brain going. I'll look at, okay, why should we do this, and this? And it'll come, oh, what a great idea. Somebody once recently submitted a thing for Valentine's Day. I called him up, said, you didn't write that. I said, look at this. I know you're writing. You didn't do it. And I said, it's so exacting on this stuff, all right? Yeah, you're right. Don't tell anybody. I said, stop doing it. And at the minimum, what you had said is attribute it to there. And you know what? And there would probably be a whole lot of people that go, hey, that's terrific. Not trying to steal that stuff and put your name on it. I think that's an important thing. And when you were talking about the satisfaction that you get from writing and by this spontaneous combustion of ideas, that we don't know quite how it works,
yes,
right?
How?
And it goes from here to here to here, and you go, oh my goodness. So you are a pleasure to talk with.
Thank you.
You are distinguished here in Miami and across Florida, and we hopefully across the country. You have affected tens of thousands of people. I might be so bold to say over the years, hundreds of thousands of people have viewed your stuff, whether it was one word or one paragraph for the whole thing, and you served the people on all different levels. We wish you continued success with that.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you so much for having me.
Ana Veciana-Suarez. Folks, you can look her up, buy her book. Where's your book available?
Here it is.
And
Beautiful
right
cover.
Okay, there you go. So you can get wherever books are sold?
Wherever books are sold, but I always pitch it to Books and Books.
Books and Books. And Coral
Books
Gables,
and
they have
books.
some other places. My congratulations to Mitch
Kaplan.
All right, for being very progressive and being right out there, right, for doing that and for sharing the joy of writing.
Thank you.
And thank you, folks. Thank you for joining us. Take care of yourselves and have a good week. Bye.